The advisor to President Zelensky, Mikhail Podolyak, stated today that the plan of Kiev includes the annihilation of the Russians. And this is what he stated, quote, "There is one plan to move forward as hard as possible with the maximum murder of Russians on this route. After that, we can't stop somewhere and say, everyone, let's think and talk about something now." People will argue and say, well, he's talking about the Russian soldiers who have invaded Ukraine. But Mikhail Podolyak has expressed his desire to slaughter the Ukrainians who are pro-Russia. And he expressed this quite clearly a number of months ago on Ukrainian television. Play the clip.
Мені видається, що цей унікальний шанс, коли можна було взагалі все дуже швидко і безболісно вирішити, був протягом перших 3-6 місяців війни. Тоді можна було багато проросійськості просто фізично зачистити. Сьогодні це трошки складніше, але знову ж таки трошки складніше. Мені видається, що цей унікальний шанс.
And he stated in that clip that when the Russians first invaded Ukraine, that was the opportunity to massacre the pro-Russian Ukrainians. And he stated in that interview that now it's a little bit more difficult to commit to such a plan of exterminating the Ukrainians who are pro-Russia. And none of this is really surprising. None of this is really surprising at all, that you have people like this in the Ukrainian government. And this is the advisor to Zelensky. The advisor to Zelensky wants to commit genocide. It's not shocking at all. Why? Look at the heroes of Ukraine. Who are the heroes? We've talked about this countless times. We've talked about this so many times. Stepan Bandera, Roman Shukhavich, Andrei Melnik. All of these people are the historical heroes, the historical figures, people who are praised in Ukrainian society. And all of these people were involved in mass murder. They were involved in the massacre of the ethnic Poles in the 1940s in the region of Volhynia in East Galicia. And what happened before those massacres? What happened was Poland and Ukraine were in a war, and Poland defeated Ukraine. And so Poland took territory that was inhabited by Ukrainians from Ukraine. And so the Ukrainians believed that the Poles had stolen territory from them, and that the Poles were occupiers, and that the ethnic Poles living amongst the Ukrainians were occupying Ukrainian territory. And so those Poles needed to be exterminated. But what's happening now? Russia is defeating Ukraine in a war. Russia has taken territory from Ukraine. And you have Ukrainians who are pro-Russia. You have Ukrainians who want to be under Russian rule. Those Ukrainians are considered to be a part of the occupation. They are a part of the occupiers. They are members of the occupying forces. This is why the Ukrainian nationalists see the Russian Orthodox Church, or I should say the Ukrainian Orthodox Church under the Moscow Patriarchate, as an institution of occupation over the Ukrainian people and territory. And that's why they want to outlaw and abolish the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is under the Moscow Patriarchate. They want to abolish it because they see it as a part of the force of occupation over the Ukrainian people. And so they massacred 100,000 Poles back in the 1940s because they saw the Poles as occupiers. And now they see the Ukrainians who are pro-Russia as also occupiers. And so history, in a way, is repeating itself. Not completely, but as I have said numerous times, history rhymes. And right now what we're seeing is a situation very similar to what was happening, or to what happened before the massacre of the Poles by the Ukrainian nationalists. They saw the Poles as occupiers. They see the Ukrainians who are pro-Russia as occupiers. And so it wouldn't be surprising at all to see one day on the news Ukrainian nationalists massacring, butchering pro-Russian Ukrainians just as they did to the Poles back in the 1940s. And they have already committed massacres. I mean, they've already murdered many really Ukrainians living in the Donbass back in the Civil War, which began in 2014. But that was mainly done by bombing. I'm talking about massacres in which you see people being decapitated, chopped up to pieces, ripping the fetuses out of pregnant women, that sort of thing. Those types of massacres. I'm not talking about massacring people through bombing, killing people through bombing, killing civilians by bombing them. I mean going in there with knives and machetes and guns and just committing the most egregious type of massacre. And I want to give you guys a little bit more information on the historical, the heroes that Ukraine holds dearly. And this goes back to the OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, which organized the extermination of the Poles in the massacres of Volyn and East Galicia back in the 1940s. And the OUN, before the massacre of the Poles, called for the ethnic cleansing of the Polish people in 1929 in a meeting in Vienna. And again, the reason why I'm bringing this up is because we see this Podolyak guy calling for the ethnic cleansing of really ethnic Russians living in Ukraine. And so we can go back to the past and we can see the Ukrainians pretty much doing the same thing in regards to the Poles. So this is what was stated in some documents that came from the OUN in 1929 from a meeting in Vienna. And this is what was stated, quote, "Only the complete removal of all occupants from Ukrainian lands, i.e. ethnic cleansing, will the possibility for an expansive development of the Ukrainian people in the borders of their own nation. In its internal political activity, the Ukrainian nation will strive to attain borders encompassing all Ukrainian ethnographic territories. Resolution: the complete removal of all occupants from Ukrainian lands, which will follow in the course of a national revolution and create the possibility for an expansive development of the Ukrainian people in the borders of their own nation." So here they are saying, well, we have to get rid of all the occupants. And this is what was being said. This is the type of rhetoric that was being said before the slaughter of the Polish people. We have to get rid of all of the occupants. And this is the type of rhetoric that's being said right now by people like Podolyak. In 1928, Stepan Lenkavsky, and this is one of the heroes of Ukraine, wrote a set of 10 commandments for the Ukrainian military organization, which would later on get absorbed into the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. And commandments 7, 8, and 10 read, quote, "Do not hesitate to commit the greatest crime if the good of the cause demands it. Regard the enemies of your nation with hate and perfidy." Perfidy literally means deception. Number 10, aspire to expand the strength, riches, and size of the Ukrainian state, even by enslaving foreigners. And Stepan Lenkavsky would later on become the leader of the OUN, and not only would he become the leader of the OUN, he would become the successor of Bandera. So Bandera, probably the most prominent of the historical heroes in Ukraine, when he was killed by the Soviets in 1959, his successor was the guy who wrote these commandments, talking about, not hesitating to commit the greatest crime. We're talking about heinous and egregious crimes, which were done, which is exactly what was seen in the Volyn massacre. Pregnant women getting murdered, their fetuses getting ripped out from their wombs, people being skinned alive, people being burned alive, really horrific stuff. Well, those actions were encouraged by people like Stepan Lenkovsky, and in 1959, he would become the leader of the OUN. And that was after the Second World War, which really goes to show that this Ukrainian nationalist movement hasn't changed. And after the Germans occupied Poland, there were leaflets that were being spread around to the Ukrainians stating, quote, "Exterminate the Poles, Jews, and communists without mercy. Do not pity the enemies of the Ukrainian national revolution. Nation, know that Moscow, Poland, Magyars, Hungarians, Jews are your enemies. Annihilate them." And that's exactly what would transpire as a result of this ideology. Nothing has really changed, and Mikhailo Podolyak proves that nothing has really changed. They're calling for ethnic cleansing. They're calling for genocide. I gotta take a sip. This is a mint iced tea. It is a hot-ass day right now, so I need it. Anyway, not much has changed. Nothing has really changed. I would say a little bit has changed. Well, you know what? Actually, no, nothing has changed. I was just about to say that a little bit has changed because the Ukrainian nationalists are a little bit more diplomatic now, or they know how to appeal to Americans on the media by acting like, you know, they're just badass heroes who are fighting against the Russian orcs. But believe it or not, that sort of marketing and that sort of rhetoric and that sort of diplomacy was utilized by the Ukrainian nationalists before the extermination of the Poles in the Volyn massacre and the massacres that would take place in other territories. In fact, the Ukrainian nationalists, they actually had a whole very intricate network that spanned from Europe all the way to North America. We're talking the United States and Canada. And for example, Ukrainian nationalists in Canada, in the United States, and other parts of Europe, they would organize demonstrations in front of embassies asking for some sort of intervention to protect the rights of Ukrainians living under Polish occupation, and they would complain that the Polish government was persecuting them and oppressing them and discriminating against them, and they wanted the international community to intervene for them, and that never happened because the reality is that when Poland went to war with Ukraine after World War I, Poland won the war. That's just the bottom line. Poland won the war. They took territory that historically belonged to Poland, and that was the end of it. The United States was not going to intervene for a bunch of Ukrainian criminals, because that's exactly what the Ukrainian nationalists were asking for. They were pretending to be victims when the reality was that Poland was simply fighting against Ukrainian terrorists. You had Ukrainian terrorists who were committing all sorts of crimes. They were putting bombs in various places. They were setting fire to barns and to granaries. They were attacking people. They were terrorists, just like the KLA. And Poland was simply fighting against these terrorists, arresting them, bringing them to justice, imposing justice upon them, which is the right of any nation, any state. And the United States and other countries knew this and recognized this, thankfully. And Ukraine was pretending to be the victim. It's just like what happened before the destruction of Yugoslavia, before the bombing of Serbia. The KLA was pretending to be a victim. But really, the reality was that the whole thing, the whole conflict between Albanians and Serbs began as the Serbian government simply fighting against Albanian terrorists. And then the whole situation escalated, and it escalated even worse with the NATO bombing of Serbia. So, yeah, very similar situation. But now you have the Ukrainian nationalists receiving and getting the support of NATO, and this has been going on for a very long time, really ever since the beginning of the Cold War. And now they are openly calling for genocide. And none of this is surprising at all. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.